I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. The words exploded from her mouth like thunder, silencing an entire room of powerful white politicians. August 22, 1964, Atlantic City, New Jersey, the Democratic National Convention, and there she stood, Fannie Lou Hamer, a black sharecropper from the Mississippi Delta, challenging the most powerful men in America on live television. If you think you've seen stories of courage against impossible odds, wait until you discover what this woman endured and accomplished. If you enjoy these stories of forgotten heroes who changed history, subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment saying, "Remember Fannie Lou Hamer," so her name is never forgotten. The cameras rolled as she spoke with raw, unfiltered truth about beatings, torture, and systematic oppression. President Lyndon Johnson, watching from the White House, was so terrified of her testimony that he immediately called an impromptu press conference to steal media attention away from her words. But it was too late. Fannie Lou Hamer had just shattered the comfortable lies that America told itself about democracy and freedom. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described being beaten nearly to death in a Mississippi jail cell just 1 year earlier. She talked about being sterilized without her consent by white doctors who saw her as nothing more than an animal. She spoke of hunger that gnawed at her children's bellies, of fear that followed her family like a shadow, of a system designed to crush every dream, every hope, every spark of dignity that dared to exist in black bodies. But there she stood, unbroken, unashamed, and absolutely fearless. Her calloused hands, worn from decades of picking cotton under the brutal Mississippi sun, gripped the podium as she delivered each word like a hammer blow against injustice. This wasn't a polished politician speaking carefully crafted words. This was raw truth, bleeding and honest, from someone who had lived every single horror she described. The white delegates from Mississippi sat in stunned silence, their faces pale with shock and rage. They had come to Atlantic City expecting a routine convention, a comfortable rubber stamping of their segregated delegation. Instead, they found themselves face to face with the living embodiment of everything they had tried to destroy. This woman wasn't supposed to exist. According to every law, every custom, every unwritten rule of Jim Crow Mississippi, Fannie Lou Hamer should have been broken, silenced, disappeared long ago. But she wasn't broken. She was magnificent. Her testimony was being broadcast live across America, reaching millions of viewers who had never heard such unflinching truth about the reality of Southern democracy. With each word, she was exposing the ugly contradiction at the heart of American politics, a nation that claimed to champion freedom while systematically denying it to millions of its own citizens. The Democratic Party leadership was in panic. This wasn't part of the script. This woman was supposed to be invisible, voiceless, powerless. Instead, she was demolishing their carefully constructed narrative about progress and equality. She was forcing America to confront the blood on its hands. How did a woman who picked cotton for 18 hours a day, who couldn't read until she was in her 40s, who had been beaten and tortured for the simple act of trying to register to vote, end up challenging the President of the United States on national television? How did someone the system tried so desperately to silence become one of the most powerful voices in American history? The answer lies in a journey that began in the cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta, where a little girl named Fannie Lou learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that sometimes surviving isn't enough. Sometimes you have to fight back, no matter the cost. What President Lyndon Johnson feared most that day wasn't Fannie Lou Hamer's words. It was the truth behind them. Because her testimony wasn't just about one woman's suffering. It was about the complete collapse of America's moral authority on the world stage. Here was a black woman, live on national television, proving that American democracy was a lie. The year 1964 was supposed to be Johnson's triumph. The Civil Rights Act had just passed. The president was positioning himself as the great liberator, the man who would finally deliver justice to black Americans. But Fannie Lou Hamer's presence in Atlantic City threatened to expose the ugly reality that the Democratic Party had been complicit in decades of terror and oppression in the South. She wasn't there by accident. Fannie Lou represented the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, a delegation of actual Mississippi voters who had been systematically excluded from the political process. While the all-white regular Mississippi delegation sat comfortably in their seats, having been chosen through elections where Black people were beaten, bombed, and murdered for trying to vote, Fannie Lou's delegation represented the true voice of Mississippi. The establishment was horrified. Here was a woman who had never set foot in a college, who had spent most of her life illiterate, who wore simple cotton dresses instead of expensive suits, and she was intellectually dismantling the entire foundation of American political hypocrisy with surgical precision. "Is this America?" she asked the convention delegates, her voice rising with righteous anger. "The land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, because everyone in that room knew the answer. This wasn't America as it claimed to be. This was America as it actually was. A nation where the color of your skin determined whether you could vote, whether you could work, whether you could live. Television cameras captured every moment as Fannie Lou described the systematic violence used to keep Black people from voting. She spoke of friends who had been shot in the back for registering voters. She described economic terrorism, how Black families were evicted from their homes, fired from their jobs, denied credit at stores, simply for attempting to exercise their constitutional rights. But what made Fannie Lou truly dangerous wasn't just that she was telling the truth. It was that she was telling it with the moral authority of someone who had suffered every injustice she described. She wasn't speaking as a politician or an activist making abstract arguments. She was speaking as a witness, a survivor, someone who bore the scars of American apartheid on her own body. The Democratic Party offered her a compromise: 2 non-voting seats for the Freedom Democratic Party delegation. It was an insult disguised as progress, and Fannie Lou rejected it instantly. "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats," she declared, "when all of us is tired." In that moment, she had done something unprecedented. A Black woman sharecropper had just told the most powerful political party in America that their compromise wasn't good enough. She had looked the entire Democratic establishment in the eye and said no. But how did this woman, born into sharecropping poverty in 1917 Mississippi, develop such unbreakable courage? What forged the iron will that allowed her to stand before presidents and governors without flinching? The answer lies in the cotton fields where she learned her first lesson about survival in Jim Crow, Mississippi. October 6, 1917, Montgomery County, Mississippi. In a sharecropper's cabin barely big enough for one family, Fannie Lou Townsend was born into a world designed to destroy her before she could even understand what freedom meant. She was the youngest of 20 children, born to parents who had been enslaved just 52 years earlier. Freedom, for the Townsend family, was nothing more than a cruel joke wrapped in legal documents they couldn't read. The Mississippi Delta stretched endlessly around their tiny cabin, thousands of acres of rich Black soil that had made white plantation owners wealthy beyond imagination, while keeping Black families like the Townsends trapped in poverty so complete it bordered on starvation. This was sharecropping, the system that replaced slavery, but kept all its essential brutalities intact. Fannie Lou's father, Jim Townsend, worked land he would never own, planting and harvesting cotton for a white landowner who kept the books, set the prices, and somehow always managed to ensure that no matter how hard the Townsends worked, they ended each year deeper in debt. It was a mathematical impossibility designed to be permanent, freedom in name only. At 6 years old, Fannie Lou joined her siblings in the cotton fields. There was no choice. Every Black child in the Delta picked cotton. It was the law of survival. While white children her age were learning to read in schoolhouses, Fannie Lou was learning to drag a cotton sack that was taller than she was, her small fingers bleeding as she pulled the sharp bolls from their stems under the merciless Mississippi sun. The work was backbreaking even for adults, but for a 6-year-old child, it was torture. Dawn to dusk, bent over in the fields, racing against time to pick enough cotton to earn the few pennies that might mean the difference between eating and going hungry that night. Her hands became permanently scarred from the cotton bolls. Her back developed a permanent ache from the constant bending. But it was her spirit that the system was truly trying to break. School was a luxury the Townsend family couldn't afford. Fannie Lou managed to attend classes for a few months each year when the cotton wasn't being harvested, walking miles to a one-room schoolhouse with no books, no supplies, and teachers who weren't paid enough to care. By the time she was old enough to understand what education might offer, it was already too late. The fields had claimed another generation. But even as a child, Fannie Lou was different. While other children accepted their fate with resigned silence, she asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Why did white families live in big houses while black families lived in shacks? Why did white children go to school with books while black children had nothing? Why did her parents work so hard yet never have enough food? The answers, when they came, were always the same. That's just how things are. But Fannie Lou couldn't accept that explanation. Even at 6 years old, she sensed that how things are was not the same as how things should be. It was a dangerous distinction to make in 1920s Mississippi. Her mother, Lou Ella, recognized the fire in her youngest daughter's eyes and feared for her life. Black children who asked too many questions, who showed too much spirit, who refused to accept their place in the racial hierarchy, had a way of disappearing in Mississippi. The cotton fields and the Mississippi River had swallowed countless young black bodies whose only crime was refusing to be broken. But Lou Ella also saw something else in Fannie Lou, a strength that reminded her of her own grandmother, who had survived slavery by learning when to bend and when to stand firm. She began teaching her daughter the most important lesson any black child could learn in Mississippi: how to survive in a world that wanted you dead. By the time Fannie Lou turned 13, she had already seen friends and neighbors beaten, shot, and lynched for infractions as small as looking at a white person the wrong way. She had learned to read the subtle signs of racial violence brewing in her community. She had mastered the art of making herself invisible when white men rode through their neighborhood at night. But she had also learned something else, something that would prove far more dangerous to the system that oppressed her. She had learned that survival wasn't enough, and at 44 years old, that lesson would lead her to make a decision that would change everything. August 31st, 1962, Sunflower County, Mississippi. At 44 years old, Fannie Lou Hamer had spent her entire life accepting the unacceptable. She had endured decades of backbreaking labor in cotton fields that would never belong to her. She had watched her children grow up in poverty, while white families prospered from the same land her family worked. She had lived under the constant threat of violence for the crime of existing as a black woman in Mississippi. But on this sweltering summer day, everything changed. A group of civil rights workers had arrived in her county, talking about something that sounded like fantasy: the right to vote. They spoke of constitutional amendments and federal laws that guaranteed every American citizen the right to participate in democracy. They talked about a world where black people could choose their representatives, where their voices could matter, where change was possible. Most black residents listened politely and then went back to their lives, understanding that dreaming too big in Mississippi was a luxury they couldn't afford. But something stirred in Fannie Lou's chest as she listened to these young organizers. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope was too dangerous. It was something else. Recognition. The recognition that she had been living a lie, accepting a reality that didn't have to exist. "I never knew that a Negro could register and vote," she would later recall. The revelation was devastating. For 44 years, she had believed that political power was simply not for people like her. She had accepted her powerlessness as a fact of nature, like the weather or the color of her skin. But it wasn't natural. It was a deliberate system, carefully constructed and violently maintained. On that day, against every instinct for survival she had developed over 4 decades, Fannie Lou made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would attempt to register to vote. She knew the risks. Everyone in Sunflower County knew what happened to black people who got uppity about voting. But for the first time in her life, the risk of action seemed smaller than the cost of continued silence. September 31st, 1962. 18 brave souls climbed aboard a bus heading to the courthouse in Indianola, Mississippi. Fannie Lou was among them, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination. The courthouse was white territory, a place where black people entered only as defendants or cleaning staff. never as citizens claiming their rights. The literacy test they encountered was designed to be impossible. "Interpret Section 16 of the Mississippi Constitution," demanded the white registrar, sliding a document across the desk that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. Fannie Lou, who had only recently learned to read basic words, stared at the complex legal language knowing it was a trap. The questions weren't tests of literacy. They were instruments of exclusion, carefully crafted to ensure that no black person could ever pass. She failed, of course. That was the point. But something remarkable happened in that moment of failure. Instead of feeling defeated, Fannie Lou felt liberated. For the first time in her life, she had looked white supremacy in the face and refused to accept its authority. She had claimed her space, however briefly, as a citizen rather than a subject. The bus ride home should have been triumphant, but the organizers noticed they were being followed. By the time they reached Ruleville, word of their courthouse visit had already spread through the white community like wildfire. Fannie Lou's act of defiance had been noted, recorded, and marked for punishment. W.D. Marlowe, the white plantation owner whose land the Hamers had sharecropped for 18 years, was waiting when they arrived home. His face was twisted with rage as he confronted Fannie Lou. "Did you go down to try to register?" he demanded. When she confirmed that she had, his response was swift and brutal. "We are not ready for that in Mississippi. You will have to withdraw your registration or leave the plantation." Fannie Lou's response would echo through history. "I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself." With those words, she severed not just her economic relationship with Marlowe, but her entire way of life. That night, she was forced to leave the plantation where she had lived for nearly 2 decades. But losing her home was just the beginning. The white community of Sunflower County was about to teach Fannie Lou Hamer what happened to black women who refused to stay in their place. And what they would discover is that some people cannot be broken, no matter how much pain you inflict. June 9th, 1963, Winona, Mississippi. The Greyhound bus had barely stopped when Fannie Lou Hamer knew they were in trouble. She and several other civil rights workers were returning from a voter education workshop in South Carolina when they made a fatal mistake. They stopped for food in a town where black people demanding their rights were considered enemies of the state. The restaurant refused to serve them. This wasn't unusual. Segregation was still the law throughout Mississippi. But when the group attempted to use the whites-only restroom at the bus station, local police were called. What happened next would haunt Fannie Lou for the rest of her life, but it would also transform her into one of the most fearless voices in American history. "Get in that car," the police officer snarled, pointing at a patrol car that would take them not to safety, but to hell. Fannie Lou, along with several companions, was arrested and taken to Montgomery County Jail in Winona. They were charged with disturbing the peace, the catch-all crime used to imprison black people who dared to challenge segregation. But this wasn't going to be a typical arrest. The white officers had recognized Fannie Lou as one of the troublemakers from Sunflower County, someone who had been organizing voter registration drives despite repeated warnings to stop. They had been waiting for an opportunity like this, a chance to break her once and for all. In the jail cell, the nightmare began. The sheriff and several deputies entered with a purpose that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with racial terrorism. "We're going to make you wish you was dead," one of them promised. It wasn't an empty threat. They dragged her to a cell where 2 black inmates were waiting. The officers had given these men a horrific ultimatum: beat Fannie Lou Hamer with a blackjack until they said stop, or face even worse punishment themselves. This was the evil genius of white supremacy, forcing black people to inflict violence on each other while white men watched and laughed. The beating was methodical and savage. The blackjack, a leather-wrapped club filled with metal shot, came down on her back, her legs, her arms, over and over again. Each blow sent waves of agony through her body. She could hear her own screams echoing off the concrete walls, but the beating didn't stop. When one inmate's arm got tired, they forced the other to continue. "Can you say yes, sir, now?" The officers taunted between blows. They wanted more than physical submission. They wanted to break her spirit, to force her to acknowledge white supremacy as her master. But even as her body absorbed punishment that should have killed her, Fannie Lou's spirit remained unbroken. The torture continued for hours. By the time they were finished, Fannie Lou could barely move. Her kidneys were damaged. Her body was covered in bruises so severe they looked like burns. She had suffered injuries that would cause her pain for the rest of her life, but something remarkable had happened in that jail cell. Instead of breaking her, the beating had forged her into something stronger than steel. Later, describing the experience, she would say, "It was then that I began to see what we was up against. The violence wasn't random or spontaneous. It was systematic, calculated, designed to maintain a racial order that depended on Black people's acceptance of their own dehumanization. But the white officers had made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed that enough pain would make any person submit, that terror could be used to silence dissent permanently. They didn't understand that some people become more dangerous, not less, when they have nothing left to lose." When Fannie Lou was finally released days later, she could barely walk. Her body was broken, but her resolve was absolute. The beating had stripped away her last illusions about the nature of white supremacy. She now understood that this wasn't a system that could be reasoned with or reformed through polite requests. This was a system that only understood power. The woman who walked out of Winona County Jail was not the same person who had walked in. The sharecropper who had spent 44 years accepting injustice was gone forever. In her place stood something new and terrifying to white supremacists across the South, a Black woman who had looked evil in the face and refused to blink. From that moment forward, Fannie Lou Hamer would become the most feared civil rights activist in Mississippi, because everyone knew that someone who had survived what she survived could never again be intimidated by threats. The system had used its worst weapon against her and failed. Now she was coming for them. Summer 1963. When Fannie Lou Hamer returned to Ruleville from her torture in Winona County Jail, something had fundamentally shifted in Mississippi's civil rights landscape. Word of her beating had spread through the Black community like wildfire, but instead of inspiring fear, it sparked something more dangerous to white supremacy: righteous anger. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, had been organizing voter registration drives across Mississippi for months, with limited success. Most Black residents were too terrified to risk their lives for the abstract concept of voting rights. But Fannie Lou's survival had created a new narrative. Here was proof that the system's worst punishments were survivable, that white supremacy was not as invincible as it pretended to be. If Fannie Lou can survive what they did to her and keep fighting, whispered conversations in beauty shops and church basements across the Delta, maybe we can survive it too. Her torture had inadvertently created the most powerful recruitment tool the civil rights movement could have asked for, a living symbol of Black resistance that could not be broken. Bob Moses, the legendary SNCC organizer, recognized the opportunity. Fannie Lou wasn't just another activist. She was indigenous leadership, someone who understood Mississippi's Black community from the inside, who spoke their language, who shared their experiences. Unlike college-educated organizers from the North, she could reach people that no one else could reach. But Fannie Lou had her own vision, one that went far beyond simple voter registration. She understood that the problem wasn't just that Black people couldn't vote. It was that even if they could vote, they would still be choosing between white politicians who saw them as subhuman. True political power required Black representation, and that meant creating an entirely new political party. In April 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was born in a small church in Jackson. The idea was revolutionary. If the regular Democratic Party of Mississippi excluded Black voters, then Black voters would create their own Democratic Party, one that actually represented their interests. They would challenge the all-white delegation at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, forcing America to choose between its democratic ideals and its racial prejudices. The white establishment initially dismissed the MFDP as a fantasy. How could illiterate sharecroppers and maids create a legitimate political party? How could people who had been systematically excluded from politics suddenly master its complexities? They underestimated both Fannie Lou's intelligence and her determination. Organizing the MFDP required skills that Fannie Lou had been developing her entire life without realizing it. Managing a household with 20 children had taught her logistics. Surviving as a sharecropper had taught her negotiation. Enduring decades of racial violence had taught her strategy. She understood how to build coalitions, how to motivate people, how to turn anger into action. The party grew rapidly as word spread through Mississippi's Black communities. Beauty shops became recruitment centers. Churches became meeting halls. Cotton fields became organizing grounds. For the first time in Mississippi history, Black people were building their own political power instead of begging white people for scraps of inclusion. But the real genius of the MFDP wasn't just its existence, it was its moral clarity. While the regular Mississippi Democratic Party was chosen through elections where Black people were excluded through violence and intimidation, the MFDP held open elections where anyone could participate. They followed the actual rules of democracy, while their opponents followed the rules of white supremacy. Fannie Lou crisscrossed Mississippi throughout 1964, speaking at churches, community centers, and cotton fields, explaining why political power mattered in terms that ordinary people could understand. "The only thing they understand is the ballot," she would tell audiences. "When you have the ballot, you can change anything." The meetings were dangerous. White supremacists regularly threatened violence against anyone attending MFDP gatherings. Several organizers were beaten, shot at, and killed. Churches were bombed. Homes were burned. But the movement kept growing because Fannie Lou had proven something crucial, that they could hit you with their worst, and you could survive. By summer 1964, the MFDP had built a parallel political structure across Mississippi. They had elected delegates, written a platform, and prepared for the ultimate confrontation. They were heading to Atlantic City, not as supplicants begging for inclusion, but as legitimate representatives demanding recognition. The Democratic Party establishment had no idea what was coming. They expected the usual polite requests for gradual progress, the kind of symbolic gestures that could be easily dismissed. Instead, they were about to face Fannie Lou Hamer, armed with moral authority they couldn't counter, and political legitimacy they couldn't deny. August 22, 1964. Atlantic City Convention Hall. The Democratic Party had gathered to crown Lyndon Johnson as their presidential nominee, confident in their vision of gradual progress and controlled change. They had scheduled the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's challenge for a quiet afternoon session, expecting minimal media coverage and even less public interest. They had no idea they were about to witness the most devastating piece of political testimony in American history. Fannie Lou Hamer stepped to the microphone wearing a simple dress and carrying the weight of centuries of Black suffering on her shoulders. The Credentials Committee sat before her. White men in expensive suits who had never spent a day in cotton fields, never felt the sting of a segregationist's whip, never had to choose between voting and feeding their children. They expected a polite appeal for inclusion. Instead, they got a moral earthquake. "I question America," she began, her voice cutting through the comfortable assumptions of Democratic Party leadership like a sword through silk. With those 4 words, she had already done something unprecedented. A Black woman sharecropper was putting the entire nation on trial before a live television audience of millions. The cameras had been rolling for routine coverage, but producers quickly realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Fannie Lou wasn't delivering a political speech. She was bearing witness to American apartheid with the moral authority of someone who had lived every horror she described. Is this America? The land of the free and the home of the brave? Where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings? Her question hung in the air like an accusation, forcing every American watching to confront the contradiction between their nation's ideals and its reality. She spoke without notes, drawing from a lifetime of experiences that most Americans couldn't imagine. She described being forced off the plantation for trying to register to vote. She talked about the systematic economic terrorism used to punish Black people who demanded their rights. She spoke of friends who had been murdered for the crime of organizing voter registration drives. But it was when she reached the Winona jail beating that the room fell into absolute silence. "They beat me until I was hard, until I couldn't bend my fingers or get up when they told me to. She testified, her voice never wavering despite the obvious pain of reliving the trauma. All of this on account we want to register, to become first-class citizens. The Credential Committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the kind of testimony they were equipped to handle. These were men accustomed to political negotiations, to compromise and backroom deals. They had no framework for responding to moral truth delivered with such devastating clarity. Television switchboards across America lit up as viewers called networks demanding more coverage of this extraordinary woman. The Democratic Party leadership, watching from backstage, realized with growing horror that Fannie Lou was not just challenging their Mississippi delegation. She was exposing the entire party's complicity in Southern apartheid. President Johnson, monitoring the situation from the White House, understood immediately that Fannie Lou Hamer represented an existential threat to his carefully crafted image as a civil rights champion. Her testimony was revealing that the Democratic Party had been accommodating and enabling white supremacist violence for decades while claiming moral leadership on racial issues. If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America, Fannie Lou concluded, her words echoing through the convention hall and into living rooms across the nation. Is this America? The land of the free and the home of the brave? Where our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings? The silence that followed was deafening. Credential Committee members stared at their hands, unable to meet her eyes. They had come expecting to dismiss a group of Mississippi troublemakers with minimal disruption. Instead, they had just witnessed the most powerful indictment of American hypocrisy ever delivered on live television. Within minutes of her testimony ending, Johnson hastily called an impromptu press conference, desperately trying to steal media attention away from Fannie Lou's devastating words. But it was too late. Her moral authority was undeniable, her logic unassailable, her courage inspiring. She had just forced America to see itself clearly for perhaps the first time in its history. The Democratic Party was now faced with an impossible choice: seat the integrated Freedom Democratic Party delegation and alienate their Southern white supporters, or reject Fannie Lou's moral claims and expose themselves as hypocrites on civil rights. Either way, a black woman sharecropper had just backed the most powerful political organization in America into a corner from which there was no graceful escape. But the real battle was just beginning. The party establishment was about to discover that offering Fannie Lou Hamer a compromise was like offering a hurricane a suggestion, completely meaningless in the face of such overwhelming moral force. The Democratic Party's response to Fannie Lou Hamer's devastating testimony revealed everything about American politics that she had been fighting against. Within hours of her speech, party bosses huddled in back rooms, crafting what they believed was a generous compromise. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party would receive 2 at-large seats at the convention, while the all-white regular delegation would keep their voting power. It was an insult disguised as progress, and Fannie Lou saw through it immediately. "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats when all of us is tired," she declared, rejecting the compromise that liberal politicians praised as reasonable. The party establishment was stunned. They had expected gratitude for their symbolic gesture, not defiance from a woman they still saw as a supplicant rather than an equal. But Fannie Lou understood something the Democratic leadership refused to acknowledge: that compromise with evil was still evil. Accepting 2 powerless seats while legitimizing a delegation chosen through violence and intimidation would have validated the very system she had suffered to challenge. Some principles, she knew, were not negotiable. The rejection sent shockwaves through liberal political circles. Prominent civil rights leaders who had spent decades working within the system urged Fannie Lou to accept the compromise, arguing that incremental progress was better than no progress at all. But she had learned through bitter experience that systems of oppression never reform themselves. They only respond to pressure that threatens their existence. "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," became her rallying cry. But it meant more than exhaustion with discrimination. It meant rejection of the politics of patience, of gradualism, of accepting half measures while Black people continued to die for demanding basic human rights. Fannie Lou was articulating a new kind of civil rights activism, one that refused to accommodate white comfort. Returning to Mississippi after Atlantic City, Fannie Lou faced a campaign of retaliation that would have destroyed a lesser person. The FBI, acting on orders from J. Edgar Hoover, began monitoring her activities, tapping her phones, and infiltrating her organizations. Local white supremacists escalated their violence, bombing churches where she spoke and threatening anyone who supported her. But instead of retreating, Fannie Lou expanded her vision. She understood that voting rights were meaningless without economic power, that political equality was impossible while Black families lived in poverty. She began organizing cooperatives, collective farms and businesses that would provide Black communities with economic independence from white-controlled institutions. The Freedom Farm Cooperative, established in 1969, was revolutionary in its simplicity. Fannie Lou helped Black families pool their resources to buy land, grow food, and build wealth outside the sharecropping system that had trapped them for generations. "A man with land is never hungry," she would say, understanding that economic freedom was the foundation of all other freedoms. She also recognized that the struggle for racial justice was connected to broader fights for human dignity. Fannie Lou became one of the first civil rights leaders to speak out against the Vietnam War, arguing that America couldn't claim moral authority abroad while denying basic rights at home. Why should young Black men fight for democracy in Vietnam when they can't exercise democracy in Mississippi? She asked. Her anti-war stance put her at odds with mainstream civil rights organizations that were reluctant to criticize American foreign policy. But Fannie Lou had never been interested in mainstream approval. She understood that real change required challenging all systems of oppression, not just the ones that were politically convenient to oppose. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, she continued organizing voter registration drives, establishing cooperative businesses, and challenging politicians who took Black votes for granted while delivering nothing in return. She ran for Congress in 1964 and 1965, using her campaigns to educate Black voters about their power rather than expecting to win in a state where voting remained dangerous for African Americans. The physical toll of decades of activism began wearing on her body. The injuries from her Winona beating never fully healed, and poverty had prevented her from receiving proper medical care throughout her life. But even as her health declined, her commitment never wavered. "You can kill my body," she often said, "but you can't kill my soul." By the mid-1970s, some of the changes Fannie Lou had fought for were becoming reality. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had dismantled many of the legal barriers to Black political participation. Mississippi elected its first Black representatives since Reconstruction. The sharecropping system that had trapped her family for generations was finally collapsing. But Fannie Lou understood that legal victories were just the beginning. The deeper challenge was transforming hearts and minds, building economic power, and creating institutions that could sustain progress across generations. She had learned that freedom wasn't something that could be granted by politicians. It was something that had to be built from the ground up by ordinary people refusing to accept their oppression. The woman who had started as an illiterate sharecropper had become something unprecedented in American history. A Black female political philosopher whose ideas about democracy, economic justice, and human rights would influence generations of activists. But her greatest legacy wasn't theoretical. It was practical proof that one person's courage could change the world. Topico 9. A Legado Eterno. March 14, 1977. Mound Bayou, Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer's body was failing, ravaged by decades of poverty, violence, and relentless activism. But even on her deathbed, she remained focused on the future rather than the past. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered to visitors who came to pay their respects. "My spirit is going to live on and keep working." She was more right than she could have imagined. The woman who died that day had accomplished something unprecedented in American history. She had transformed herself from an illiterate sharecropper into one of the most influential political figures of the 20th century. She had challenged presidents, revolutionized the Democratic Party, and fundamentally changed how America thought about democracy, human rights, and political power. But her greatest achievement was proving that ordinary people could create extraordinary change. When Fannie Lou first attempted to register to vote in 1962, Mississippi had fewer than 7,000 registered black voters out of a population of nearly 500,000 African Americans. By the time of her death in 1977, hundreds of thousands of black Mississippians were registered to vote, and the state had elected more black officials than any other state in the nation. The political transformation she had sparked was nothing short of revolutionary, but her influence extended far beyond voting rights. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's challenge at the 1964 Democratic National Convention had forced the party to fundamentally change how it selected delegates. Never again would segregated delegations be seated at Democratic conventions. The party adopted new rules requiring diverse representation, changes that reverberated through American politics for decades. Her economic vision proved equally transformative. The cooperative movement she helped establish created a model for black economic self-determination that influenced community organizing across the country. From urban food cooperatives to rural farming collectives, activists drew inspiration from Fannie Lou's understanding that political freedom required economic independence. Young activists in the 1970s and 1980s studied her speeches and writings, learning how to connect local struggles to broader movements for justice. Her phrase, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," became a rallying cry for anyone fighting oppression, from anti-apartheid activists in South Africa to women's rights organizers in America. The feminist movement, initially dominated by white middle-class women, began to grapple with issues of race and class, partly because of Fannie Lou's example. She had demonstrated that the struggle for women's rights could not be separated from fights against racism and economic exploitation. Her intersectional analysis predated academic theories by decades, growing out of lived experience rather than scholarly study. Perhaps most importantly, Fannie Lou had redefined what political leadership could look like. She proved that formal education and elite connections were less important than moral courage and authentic connection to community struggles. She showed that the most powerful political voices often came from the margins rather than the center, from people who had nothing to lose rather than those protecting their privileges. Modern voting rights activists invoke her memory when fighting contemporary efforts to suppress black political participation. When politicians attempt to restrict voting access, roll back civil rights protections, or ignore the concerns of marginalized communities, organizers ask, what would Fannie Lou do? The answer is always the same. Fight back with everything you have. Her international influence continues to grow as activists around the world study her strategies and philosophy. From democracy movements in Asia to indigenous rights struggles in Latin America, Fannie Lou's example demonstrates how grassroots organizing can challenge entrenched power structures. Her life proves that change doesn't require permission from those in authority. It requires courage from ordinary people. The Democratic Party that once tried to silence her now claims her as a founding mother of modern progressive politics. Politicians who would have crossed the street to avoid her in 1964 now quote her speeches and invoke her legacy. It's a testament to her influence that the same institution that rejected her moral claims now sees association with her memory as politically valuable. But perhaps Fannie Lou's greatest legacy is the simplest. She demonstrated that in America, even the most powerless person can become powerful if they refuse to accept their powerlessness. She showed that democracy is not a spectator sport, that freedom is not a gift to be received, but a right to be claimed, and that ordinary people have extraordinary capacity for courage when they decide to stop accepting the unacceptable. Today, as America continues to grapple with issues of voting rights, economic inequality, and racial justice, Fannie Lou Hamer's voice echoes across the decades with undiminished power. She reminds us that real change has never come from the top down, but always from the bottom up, from people who were sick and tired of being sick and tired, and decided to do something about it. If you want to honor the memory of this extraordinary woman, subscribe to this channel and comment, "Remember Fannie Lou Hamer," so her name and her message are never forgotten. Because as long as people remember her story, the spirit that could not be broken will continue to inspire new generations of freedom fighters.